Daniel, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to have you here today, man. And I mean, I'm just so glad we got connected back earlier this year. I mean, literally just the amazing things that come from Instagram sometimes, dude. For people who aren't familiar with you and all the amazing stuff you're doing in the sports performance space, would you mind filling them in a bit about who you are and all the amazing things you have going on, man?
Sure thing, Dan. Happy to join you here on the Dan and Dan show. Slight spin-off from your normal podcast episode, but yeah. So my name is Daniel Day. I've been a sports performance coach for, gosh, it's almost been 10 years. I can say 10 years now. That's kind of exciting when you can cross a decade. So I've been in the sports performance world for 10 years. I started in hoops. I was a hooper growing up. Started in Big Ten basketball as an intern. From there, it took me to P3 Sports Science, which many of you guys are familiar with. I was in Atlanta, Georgia, as a sports performance coach there, almost 4 years. And then I got married. My wife started playing professional volleyball. So that took me across the world. We moved to Europe about 6 years ago, and we've been on the road ever since. So I've worked as a private performance consultant for professional athletes in Europe and really across the world, but dabbling in the volleyball scene. Still have a couple hoopers, but primarily it's drifted into soccer in Europe because we know that is the king sport over there. But yeah, doing a little bit of everything. I've kind of put together a holistic model of training for my athletes. I started my company 2 years ago, actually almost 3 years ago now, called CRFTD Athlete, where I wanted to craft athletes not only in the weight room, but also in their mind, their body, and their spirit as well. I really like to apply my faith to what I do, and that was my way of kind of putting my spin on private sector work outside of the team setting. So yeah, right now I just work as a private consultant to teams, organizations, and private players looking to take their game to the next level.
That's so impressive. I love that backstory and all the work that you do. And just to bring the spiritual piece into it for a second there, that comes up so often when I'm talking with high level athletes, just the importance of their faith based practice that way and how that carries over into their athletic success. I mean, just
100%.
recently we had an All American pole vaulter, Tenley from Baylor, on the podcast, and we got into that quite deep. And it's like, a lot of times people don't think about that or they don't talk about that for one reason or another. And it's like,
Right.
hey, look, like, regardless of if your goal is high performance or your goal is just to be an amazing person, in my opinion, and I might be a little biased about this, but I feel like faith has to have a seat at that table. So that's something that I always like to bring up when it comes up because I feel like not enough people are comfortable talking about it. And it's like, look, like we have to be comfortable having those conversations. We have to be comfortable talking with athletes if they have questions to point them in the right direction one way or another.
100%. First off, shout out to Baylor Bears. My wife's a grad from Baylor, so I love that. But yeah, like you said it, I mean, working in the private sector, I start to spend a lot of time with the athletes, and you realize that they're not just athletes, they're people too. They have concerns outside of their sport. I know that's wild to say, but like you realize there's more to them than what you see on TV, than the jersey they wear, the team they represent. And it's a perfect tie into spirituality because, like with my faith as a Christian, it's like we look to what we place our identity in to define us. And that can be really dangerous or a huge advantage. So with these athletes, they're defined by the name on their jersey, their wins, their losses, their physical performance dictates their worth, literally. And that's just the reality of it. But mentally, that can be a pretty big price to pay as an athlete. So, being there as not only their sports performance coach, helping with their nutrition, their recovery, but also there as a mentor to say like, hey, like you're bigger than this game. You're not defined by this sport. If this sport were completely taken away from you, what's left? We did a lot of sermons and like small studies about the man under the jersey. And we had a lot of really good effect size with that because it was like, you can do the perfect training program. You can have the perfect recovery. The week can be completely dialed in. But if mentally they're not there, if like spiritually just something isn't right, they're not going to play well. And then it's, what is it all for? So that's what really inspired me to, start my own company and start Crafted Athlete. That's what, if you can see, it's kind of far away, but Crafted Athlete, it stands for Christ rose from the dead. So I kind of abbreviated Crafted in that way. But yeah, that's really my main purpose of what I do is just seeing the athlete as more than just a player, but as someone that, does have a mind, body, and spirit that all work together for the betterment of their performance.
Absolutely, that's incredible, Daniel, and I think that's why you and I get along so well is we just feel very similarly amongst a lot of those things that way, and I think the other piece that I wanna touch on real quick is, you know, athletes, as you mentioned, have a personal life. They're people outside of sport. They're more than just an athlete, but I think it amazes me, at least, how often those athletes are kind of a bit of a mess outside of sport, for lack of a better way to put it. The amount of
Yeah.
university athletes I've worked with that are like, living off of a diet of Skittles and whatever they can get at McDonald's that day. It's like, it's crazy to me how many of these little things have almost been forgotten about, from eating right to taking care of your sleep, and even some of the other teachings that come from a faith-based background that way. It's like, hey, maybe don't go on OnlyFans at night. Like, I can't believe we have to like tell people
Right.
that, but,
Yeah.
like, there's origins from that that go back to faith, in my opinion, that way, and I think now more than ever, we need that holistic model and holistic mindset where we are thinking of everything and addressing everything from psychology to physiology to the physical function and beyond that way. I'm interested to hear more about kind of the origins of your holistic model, or holistic framework, I should say. I've switched my vocabulary to the word framework extensively per recommendation of our
Love
mutual
that.
friend Kyle Salmons, because
Love
a
that.
lot of
Love that.
times we are so rigid and structured in what we do, when in reality, we almost need to be a little bit more fluid. We have to have guiding principles, but we have to be able to adapt to the individual athlete in front of us. So, how did you kind of go about developing this holistic framework that you've mentioned?
Yeah, 100%. And I think framework is the perfect word because, you're dealing with people. They all have their own individual background, their individual story, their individual injury history. Some of them are younger, some of them are older, some of them have high training ages, low training ages. It's just, they're too individual to compare them one to one and just copy and paste to each person. So, yeah, Dan, I've seen it all with the athletes and, with the team setting, your biggest constraint is time, right? You're bound into the time of the schedule, into what you can do. Maybe you see them for an hour each day. The other 23, you really have no idea what they do. You have a hope and a wish of what they're doing, but the reality is, it's probably not as pretty as you'd wish it is as the performance coach or strength director. So, like I've seen a little bit of everything as a private coach. I've had relationships, that worked really well. It's definitely a relationship based practice. If we connect as athlete and coach, it can go really well. Some guys it just doesn't work that well. It's fine. It's not for everyone, but like it comes down to, and we've had some great talks off the air about this. It's like you know the stuff that we follow as practitioners and the coaches, they're not following. Like they don't hear that, like freezing your blueberries, it preserves the antioxidants longer than leaving them fresh in the fridge. Like they don't follow that stuff. Maybe some of my guys do now, but like, they're just not into it. Not to say that they're against it, but if they're not into it, they're not aware. And if they're not aware, they can't make those changes that are going to have that effect that we know is going to help them. So simply just educating them on, hey, staring at your phone screen minutes before you want to go to sleep probably isn't the best for your sleep quality to recover overnight. Okay, like they just didn't know, and now we can make some changes. I can help them. And I know it sounds like parenting in a little bit, and like a way it's but at the same time, if they're bought in, and that's another thing I kind of want to touch on. It's if they're bringing me in to work with them, the buy-in is already there. In the team setting, you might not get that because, they have to be there. But if I'm working with them, it's because they want me to be there. So when I say these things, they're more likely to listen because they're like, all right, I'm bringing this guy in. He's trying to help me. He has no outside ambitions other than help me succeed and better provide for my family. So, those small things like you mentioned, sleep hygiene, the low hanging fruit of gratitude, waking up and seeing something bigger than the sport that you're about to go play or practice. There's having interest outside of the sport. Talking about that. Those type of things. And like you said about the faith background, having an identity in something that isn't defined by your performance. All those things holistically tie together to really create this model or framework that then you can take and go into those, those sports science principles that we know work, those periodization models that we know work, that microdosing strategy and season that we know works. And then we can start to apply, those principles. But, we're talking about a much bigger effect size looking at that, we'll call it the 23 hours compared to that 1 hour of, performance-based sport training. And that's what, really putting that holistic model together. And then, we didn't touch on this, but diet can be a whole nother podcast, what they're eating. I studied nutrition in college a little bit. I worked as a private chef for a little bit in Atlanta. So I love to cook, so introducing athletes to, pre and post workout, recovery nutrition. What is the first thing they eat? A lot of guys would go straight to the club when they wake up. They don't eat anything. I'm like, what are you doing? Like, you're not eating anything? Like, so just simple things like that made big changes, performance wise and recovery wise. And they just felt better.
Absolutely. No, I think that's so well put. And one of the things that came to mind as you were talking is how far we collectively have as a space have gotten away from that. I just think about some of the different middle school, high school, college athletes that I've worked with that, from the time that they were literally in grade school, they were literally dedicated to one sport year round. And that came before everything else because the sport was the life. And,
Yeah.
the training to support the sport, if it wasn't sport specific, whatever that means, was put
Right.
on hold. The nutrition was put on hold because you're always on the go, you're always on the road, so you just need something quick and convenient, if you
Right.
even have time to eat at all between practices and games and tournaments and so on that way. Hydration was put on hold because, we can get there quicker if we don't stop the car every 2 hours to hit the rest
Right.
right? And then you factor in the fact that, hey, you can't get plugged into the local community because maybe I'm not there that often. Hey, maybe I can't develop any kind of spiritual practice because I'm not present on Sunday
Exactly.
mornings
Yeah.
or whatever it is that way. And it's like you take all these factors and you compound them over the span of like a decade or more. And it's like, no wonder why the athletes are running into issues because we have gotten them so deep at one thing. They're an inch wide and a mile deep, which is not always a bad thing, but they're that deep on one thing without any kind of supporting structure and framework around that one thing. There's nothing holding it up. You built the house, but you forgot the foundation, and eventually that
100%.
thing collapses, and you start to point fingers at one another, saying, "Well, it's your fault," or "It's your fault," or maybe it's because I did this, and you sit there and question yourself. When in reality, I think we as a space have more of a development problem, where instead of developing people as people, we're developing people as high caliber athletes and completely neglecting the person element to it. And I think the more we reintroduce that person first element from a young age, nonetheless, the better we're going to see not just the performance side, but maybe some of these other stats that keep getting dropped from, depression and anxiety rates in athletes after they wrap up their careers and so on that way. Maybe those will start to change as well, because I think we're all in this space to make improvements and make things better. I mean, I like to say I fix things at the end of the day, but it's like, ultimately we have to first have the difficult conversations and acknowledge what the problem is and what we collectively should be doing about that. And sometimes that doesn't come back to the perfect periodized program. That comes back to just having conversations with people as people at the end of the day.
Right. 100%. Especially with, like it can be applied to any setting from the like an athlete's first year of playing a sport. They're 5 or 6 years old. Those moments with their coach or their parents or guardians in that case are going to be impactful to kind of shape how they look at sport, how they look at training, how they look at that environment as a stressor or as a place that they can grow and thrive. And then taking that all the way to the top of, a very well-trained professional athlete, you know, they're always chasing something. They're constantly looking forward. They're constantly looking ahead. And like you said, if that foundation isn't there, the house isn't stable and it's going to come down, so that's goes back to like one of my first framework principles in working with my athletes is gratitude. uh, you know they're always looking to where they're going, where they want to go, the next contract, the bigger team, more minutes, more strength, more speed, more everything. And when you get into this uh like spin of like more is more, you kind of lose sight of where you are. And gratitude brings you back. And when you have that gratitude, it grounds you. And then when you're grounded, you can start to look at what do you have in front of you and how can you maximize where you currently are in the situation that you're in with the cards that you have in your hand. And that realization, that mindset shift has been a game changer for my athletes. So bringing them back to gratitude and, there's many biblical principles of gratitude, like all of Paul's letters in the New Testament immediately start with thanksgiving. There's a reason for that. There's a reason for thanksgiving and gratitude. It does ground you in a way that nothing else does because it puts you exactly where you are. And that's really the only thing that we can presently change is the right now. And when you explain to your athletes, like, hey, don't worry about that bad game you had in the past. Don't worry about the game that's coming. Worry about today. Worry about this moment. How can you get, people write books about it, the 1%, 1% better each day. Like there's a theme that goes along with making those small incremental changes right now that will compound over time. That consistency compounds. That's what I'm telling my athletes. Gratitude, compound consistency, make the changes and decisions you can right now. And that's what's going to lay that foundation and build a stable house on top of it so that it doesn't collapse. But like you said, it goes back to all of those things that you mentioned from early childhood sports, your early coaches, your parents, your guardians, that relationship you have with the environment you're in is going to shape how you look and how you grow with that as you get older.
Absolutely, and there's something to be said about the power that comes with that mindset shift towards a bit of an attitude of gratitude, and I know that might sound cliched, but it's like, you just look at the little things that pop up on the day-to-day, and it's like, I have so much to be freaking thankful for. It's like, "Hey, I
Yeah.
woke up today." Some people didn't. I got to go
Right.
to the gym and get a gnarly upper body pump. Some people have never been to the gym before. Some people don't know what it feels like to get an awesome bicep pump. It's like
Right.
you can go on and on and on and peel back the layers of how many little things that you have to be thankful for. And I think the other important component to that is not just being thankful for the good times, because it's very easy to be appreciative
Oh,
of all
yeah.
the good things, but you almost have to find a way to appreciate and be thankful for the trials, the tribulations, and the struggles that life throws at you, because ultimately those times are there to test you as a person, to test you as an athlete and kind of see what you're made of, right? I kind of look at those like kind of like how we look at game day. It's like, hey, I'm being called to do something. I'm being called to rise to the occasion. Am I ready to perform? Am I prepared to perform and overcome this obstacle? And it's one of those things that I think we have to learn how to be thankful for the times when things don't go our way, for the times when things do get challenging, the times when, yeah, maybe we put in all the work and all the effort and we did everything right, but for some reason we still ended up taking a left turn at Albuquerque, even though we didn't want to.
Right.
It's just one of those things that, hey, because things don't go our way doesn't mean that it's it doesn't mean that it's not going to work out. It's just a matter of, hey, it might be a different destination than what you wanted to. And sometimes you have to lose everything in order to regain more than you've ever gotten in the past. That way, it's just to your point, we've always had this mindset that more is better. And the more we collect, the more we accumulate, the better off we're going to be, when sometimes there's significant addition by subtraction. And that goes to anything from the personal side, but even the performance side as well. Like, you mentioned sports science earlier. It's like the more complicated you get in your sports science framework and the more you try and like narrow down every single metric on a 7-page report, like, I'm sorry, you're going to get lost. You
Right.
have to find a way to simplify things, not oversimplify it, but just get it to a level that's a little bit more actionable, a little bit more insightful, that you can draw great conclusions off of that way. And I think the more you buy into those concepts, the more successful you are in any endeavor in life and performance.
100%. Just to touch on that again, that, like you said, the high days are great, but the low days are low. But the way that I explain it to my athletes is you're going to have those peaks and troughs, but that gratitude and that identity is what's going to make those peaks and troughs more balanced so that when you do go low, it's okay, it's fine. You can bounce back up. When you go high, you realize, okay, this is temporary, and you start to find stability. And it really comes from placing your identity in something that isn't performance based. And that's why, we said having a faith background is so important because it does shift your mentality, it shifts your purpose, it shifts your identity in something that is bigger and greater outside of that sport. So that is so important because you're not gonna ride that roller coaster that life throws at you. Like, you're not gonna every game's not gonna be great. You're not always gonna move forward and up. It's just not gonna happen. But you can change how low you go for sure, and you can change the time that you spend down there. So that's really what that mentality shift is gonna do, because life happens and, like, we can't control that, but, we can control how we respond to it and how we react.
Absolutely, absolutely, and ultimately, it just shifts things back to the fact that, hey, maybe we get so caught up in all of these other external factors that don't matter as much, right?
Right.
Like, does the weather on game day matter that much?
Right.
Or is it maybe how we respond to it, right? And I
100%.
think the more you kind of internalize some of those things, and instead of looking for external things to blame it all on, the more you internalize some of them, the better off you can be, right? I just talked about this at length yesterday on a podcast recording with Harvey Martin, where we were going over a lot of the different neural stimulation type things that athletes are exposed to on the day to day. And I know you and I have had similar discussions, from the light on their phones to the artificial lighting at the stadiums and the hours that they might be playing at, and so on that way. Like, it's a very sympathetic driven state, but we can't change that. We can't go in and request that the stadium put in like a special like blue light filter on all the lights so that we can,
Right.
optimize our circadian rhythm with the game. Like, no one's going to do that. So we have to instead internalize it a little bit and say, hey, look, this is what's going on. How do I rise to the occasion? How do I respond to that? And I think going back to where we started with your holistic model, like, that is the starting place. It's like I have to make sure that all these boxes are checked for me as a person. And if I'm missing those things, which are kind of like the minimums just to be a human, for lack of a better way to put it,
Right.
like,
Yeah.
if I can't even do that, I'm not going to perform at my best when it comes time to, perform in a crazy environment like that.
Yeah, and as a coach, you're looking for what matters most. Like, what has the biggest effect size? What is the change I can make that's gonna have the biggest effect on my athlete? And like, in today's age, we're blessed by so many tools. We have more tools than we've ever had. As technology grows, as like, things get more compact, travel friendly, like, there's so many things that we can do. But still, the supreme things are free. They're easy, and they're just driven by discipline and choices. Sleep will always be the number one recovery modality. That's never going to change. So, like, it just goes back to, like, making the changes and prioritize what matters most. And when you figure out what matters most, then you go backwards from there. And I'm not anti massage gun or anti, little tools and knickknacks. I think it's great, but the first thing I'm gonna ask is, how are they sleeping? Like, what are they eating? Like, are they hydrating enough? I'm kind of gonna work my way backwards, and then, once we get there, like, sure, like, I think that, I don't feel worse if I use a massage gun on my TFL before I start. Like, how much does it help? I don't know, but I don't feel worse. So I'm not like anti anything or like team only this. I really don't appreciate when a lot of coaches kind of like follow one box, or like we talked about, like, don't operate in a framework. They operate, in very narrow spaces. Because I think everything can have a purpose if, there's a reason behind it or some rationale for that specific case. But yeah, just working backwards from what matters most.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on that a little bit more, because that's something just like you, I notice all the time. And maybe I've been guilty of it myself in the past, is like sometimes we pick weird hills to die upon. And I
Right.
think there's a lot of factors that go into that. But some of these different things I see people promoting as like the only way. I mean, unless we're talking about the good Lord, there's not a whole lot else that is the one and only way to something that way. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about like why you feel like coaches, instead of developing robust frameworks that cover a lot of different things, instead just pick like one extreme example and they just live and die by that, right? Like, hey, everything is 5-3-1, or everything is going to be Aldoa, or everything is going to be PRI. I'm not saying that those things are bad, but I'm saying that I haven't found any one thing in the performance space that covers 100% of what athletes need 100% of the time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, when a coach starts off like that, you immediately can assume a few things. Like their experience internationally probably, hasn't existed. They've probably worked in that exact space or that exact tunnel their whole career. Maybe they had a coach ahead of them that died on that hill, so they will also die on that hill, and they've really never explored other things, or have had the chance to work with other athletes outside of that realm there. I mean, just kind of speaking generally here, but like just being able to peel back the layers and ask yourself why you're doing things, I think can be a huge reality check and kind of pull your ego out of it as a coach and just understand like, how can I break this down into its smallest parts? And I was really blessed with some incredible coaches that I learned from, and my time at P3, P3 breaking things apart and analyzing athletes from, like kinetic and kinematic data. It opens you up to kind of see more than just an exercise. You see that as a tool to get to an outcome that you're looking for. Um, and that might not be the best tool, but it's a tool you're going to try and implement and retest. And you have to know that there might be a tool that's better, or there might be a better option for that athlete, given these constraints, given that sport, given this goal that we're trying to reach. So it's really just taking your ego out of it and being able to try different things, learn why people tried those things, see the success they had with it, and maybe take some of that framework and combine it with maybe an ideology that you have or a belief that you have with someone else's framework. And, it's really just being open to have those discussions. And I really enjoy having conversations with different strength coaches, even those that will die on a single hill. I think it's great. You can learn something from everyone, and I think it really just, it goes back to being open to see an athlete as more than just, all right, I'm trying to hit these exercises, check these boxes, and you have to force them into these situations, but to ask coaches like, well, why do you do this? Or why do you oh, they have to do barbell back squat. If they don't, like, that's like the only way that you can get lower extremity strength is by barbell back squat. And then you're like, all right, well, is there another way that you could do it? Possibly, is there something else out there that could also give us the same effect size as that exercise that you will die on that hill. So you can kind of go all day back and forth of, different hills people die on. But for me personally, I like to learn a little bit from everyone and kind of see what works and then test it out on myself. My wife is definitely the guinea pig of my operation. She wears that crown proudly. So yeah, I mean, like just small things from each coach that I've had the experience to talk and connect with can be applied, or not applied. And it's okay. It's okay to have difference of opinion. I think that there's multiple ways to train an athlete. I do think there are certain principles that are research driven to the point where I don't think that there's a better way outside of there. Um, I know you mentioned Kyle Salmons. Shout out to Kyle Salmons drinking a good single origin pour over now. We text about coffee more than we do training, and that's okay. But there's certain principles. I know you've had him on the podcast. I'm sure you talked about the Beast Factory
The
framework.
Beast Factory, man.
Yeah, I mean, there's certain principles that I don't think that inversing them is going to necessarily be better in any context. So, there's certain things that I like to stay true to, and how I warm up athletes, how I prepare them for explosive movements, how I prepare them for sprinting, that I really wouldn't change. But then outside of there, the possibilities are endless. The tools you could use are endless. The constraints that you operate in are so individual, me to you, to, Kyle with the Cardinals, to everyone has their own constraints that maybe forces them to make a decision that is different from you, but not necessarily better or worse, just different given that constraint, given that athlete situation. So yeah, hopefully that answered your question. I didn't mean to dance around it.
No, I mean, I think that was great, and just to kinda hit some of those key points again and kinda tie it back to some stuff we mentioned earlier. I mean, I think when you pick a hill to die on and you just stay there and it's extreme, it's out there, going back to what you mentioned before about the concept of buy-in, like, it becomes very difficult to get athletes to believe in some of those things. Like, they might trust that you know what you're talking about, trust that you have your degrees and certifications and you've worked with so and so and all those different things, But, if you're doing something super extreme like that, they still might question a little bit, right? Like, if I take an
100%.
athlete, like there was one that I was working with who had multi-level lumbar disc herniations. If I took that athlete and tried and force, 5-3-1 back squat on her, she'd look at me and be like, "Are you sure?" Like, are you
Right.
sure you want me to do that?" I'm not saying that back squats are bad for the back by any means, but I'm saying, like, there's some times when people just naturally question a little bit. When you shift your approach to being a little bit more fluid and kinda like you mentioned, trying to find what everyone can teach you, because I think everyone can teach us something. It's just a
Mhm.
matter of, is that what I want to do or what I not don't wanna do?
Sure.
You kinda have to develop a filter, and I've found that just kind of comes with experience and being exposed to things over time. And as you mentioned, trial and error. It's like, hey, before I implement this with my athletes, I want to try it with myself, see how it feels. And yeah, maybe it slows down the implementation pipeline a little bit, but then I at least know what the response is going to be and if it's something that I want to elicit or maybe I want to stay away from. But I think the more robust you are in filtering out the good from maybe the less than optimal, for lack of a better way to put it, and the more considerate you are at matching what you want to do from the principles that you're looking to drive that way in the athlete with the athlete as a person, the better your concept of quote unquote buy-in is going to be. So much so that I don't think you really need to give any kind of sales pitch. I don't think buy-in is really something that's going to be forced. It just kind of falls into place and comes naturally, right? Like, you're literally creating an environment that the athletes want to be a part of, that supports them and checks all their boxes. And you as a coach are not kind of alienating yourself into a planet that others don't want to be on because you're picking fights with people on the freaking Instagram. Like, it drives me crazy. It's like, why don't we shift our mindset towards that? Everyone can learn something from another and everyone can kind of work together to make this space better. Cause I think this space is so, so beautiful when people come together with that kind of interest in the common good and how we can provide for the greater good of the athlete. But in order to do that, you need that high respect and that low ego kind of mindset. And that's just something that is not always prevalent, I find.
Yeah, no, for sure. You totally nailed it. And, having worked with a lot of athletes in a private setting and, they're like my friends now. So I find myself explaining to them my thought process out loud because, in that setting as a private coach where you're not working for the club, but you're working outside of the club, there's a lot of variables that change that are out of my control, as far as, practice time, load management, how they feel, so I'll go into a session or a week with like almost like three workouts or three plans, and I have to choose which one. But a lot of the time it's collaborative with the athlete and they see that I'm not just having them do Tuesday's workout because it's Tuesday. There's a little more that goes into it, and they see that I'm critically thinking about how I can optimize their program for them, and I'm thinking about those variables. I'm planning forward. I'm thinking in reverse, and there's so many ways that I'm looking at it, and they see that, and like you said, that buy-in becomes stronger, that trust becomes stronger because you're not forcing them into something that, "Oh, I do this because this is me, this is what I believe in, I'm sponsored by this product, so we gotta do this." It's like, no, it's like, I'm trying to use these tools to better your situation so that you can feel 100% for game day.
I
So,
want to
yeah, that's
mention
just a great
too,
point.
I want to mention too, all the things we've discussed so far are not just exclusive to the performance side and the human element, but also apply to the rehab side as
Mm,
well. Because physical therapists and other rehab providers can be just as guilty of this as anyone else. I know because I am one, and
right.
I've been stuck on that Mount Stupid spot of the Dunning Kruger effect before. And it's really one of those things that I think, as long as you're willing to open your mind a little bit, like, you can take all these concepts that we've discussed so far and apply them to any setting. It's not just a strength coach thing or just an
100%.
athlete thing. Like, it doesn't matter what your title is. If you're in this sports performance or sports medicine type of space, like,
Yeah, just
do
human
concepts
performance,
that
just
you need
wanting
to
to
be
be better.
applied.
Human performance, just trying to be better, like, these are like things that I apply for myself. How am I feeling? How was my run time? What was my sleep like? My diet? Like, I don't get paid to play a sport, but I would rather like function optimally than less, you know? So, yeah, this really goes for anyone and any practitioner that has any responsibility to make someone better at something. It's just critical thinking, you know, taking your ego out of it and then making informed choices based on that information.
On top of that, going back to your personal story, you've worked in basketball, you've worked in volleyball, you've worked in soccer, and this framework has held tried and true amongst all those different sports. And I think sometimes, I'm probably guilty of this myself, we like to get sports specific with what
Oh,
we
yeah.
do. And I think that there's a need for it at times,
Right.
especially if you're following certain periodization approaches. Like there is a time to be highly, highly specific, but there's also a time to just kind of step back and do the 20% of the things that give you 80% of the results at the end of the day. And I like to think that everything we've discussed so far is what gives you that 80%. And if none of those things are, if something's amiss of those things, the other stuff, the highly sports specific stuff, doesn't really fall into place like we want it to. And I think that's one of the skills and arts that's missing in a lot of performance coaches and a lot of rehab providers as well, is this ability to just pick up and take their framework and apply it to any sport, any athlete. I think that's really one of the hallmarks of what separates the good from the great coaches and good from great providers in the space, is the ability to go from basketball to volleyball to soccer. And you look at some of the demands, like I can't really make a lot of comparisons between volleyball and soccer, but you're able to take a framework and apply it regardless of what the athlete's sport is. And I think there's something incredibly valuable in that.
Yeah, it was definitely a little bit of uh, it was difficult going from strictly hoops. You know, volleyball was kind of an easier entry because it was my wife. You know, so I got an easy entry there to apply, and I was like, okay, you know, it's dynamic sport athlete. You know, there are some similarities there, but it went back to like going to those first experiences I had, under great S&Cs in college, back to P3, peeling back the layers of the sport, back to this is how this athlete moves. What are the demands that this sport requires of them? What are the positions and angles that their specific role needs to have? What do they need to do well? What do they not do well? And how can we kind of piece a program together that's going to have them function optimally given all of those constraints? So, like when Gia moved to Europe to play volleyball, and I followed her out there, I got connected with some players out there with football. I was actually working with a facility that just opened up. They were trying this like American style of sports science in Italy, which is extremely rare over there. It's very uncharted territory in that part of the world for sports science and S&C. So, like I got a chance with a few players, and it just kind of like caught fire. Like the one guy was like telling another guy, and like we were kind of just applying the same principle that I use. I haven't played a minute of soccer in my life. So that was like hard at first, but then when they're like, okay, like he understands how my body works, he understands the demands of my sport and my position, he sees the things that I do really well, and he sees the things that I can improve upon that will make my position and my work easier. And we just kind of pieced it together, and that framework applied so nicely. But it did take, some, I don't want to say like, I can use the word craftiness for my business, but it took some craftiness to be able to peel back those layers to see them as, this is just a human who's trying to move in this way. They do this really well. They don't do this really well. How can I meet them in the middle of choosing the things that will help them do what they do well and complement that without, going into this rabbit hole of all these things that might matter a little bit, but won't have a huge effect size on them. So, we had like a first season to just kind of apply that and see how that worked in a private setting. My wife stayed in Europe, so the guys were like, "We got to run this back." And then I got some more clients out there, some more soccer players, and it just kind of grew and grew from there. And it was amazing. Like I enjoyed working with the soccer guys more than I did any of the hoops guys. No offense to the hoops guys, I love hoops, but I had so much fun with these soccer players because they were so strong and athletic and skilled, but because of the demands of the sport, and their upbringing, their training age was relatively low. And I'll tell them this, like they know this information. They've been playing professional soccer since they were 16. They hadn't really gone through a real, like, let's say, American collegiate S&C program. Like, they played soccer all year round. And it's like the classic, like, AAU story, or, thing that we're having now in America of, like, they're playing their sport so much, they don't have time to develop. They don't have time to train. It's just not there. And then with the training that they were getting, wasn't super high quality. It just wasn't, it wasn't doing much for them. So, for them to experience, a framework that was designed for them, for their position, for, what they needed to do, but also identified the things that they didn't do well and worked on those, they saw improvement right away. So it was almost, I don't want to say it was easy, but, like, to put them in that framework, they saw a lot of improvement right away. And they were like, wow, this is great. Like, I feel good. I'm moving well. Like, what did you do to me? Like, and I don't mean to make it sound like I'm, like, giving them some, secret formula. I put a lot of care and design around what I do, but, it was just the small things. It's taking care of the small things, and, taking care of their body in the right way. And this is even before I got into the holistic rabbit hole of those smaller things that we talked about in the beginning here. But just from an S&C standpoint, like training them on position, coaching position, was a huge thing that these guys needed. They did what they did really well. They were getting paid a lot of money to do this position extremely well, and they do it really fast. And it's hard to get them to slow down, to identify their inefficiencies, or the biomechanical positions that weren't so optimal in the way that they were moving, to make them better. So, coaching position was huge for them. And, shout out, ISO Fit. I know you're an isometric fan here. Subtle nod there, but, that's always been a part of my training, is isometric work, simply for being able to slow them down, to coach and cue positioning and the angles and shapes that they're going to see in the sport that matter a lot. And you would see these guys that look like superheroes, right? They're extremely strong, absolutely crumble in isometric positions with no weight, just essentially getting them in these angles and shapes and having them hold it and start to apply tension, for like, 20, 30, 40 seconds, whatever protocol we were running. Guys would crumble. Like, it was like, wow, like, they really do this well extremely fast. But then when you start to, like, connect the segments together, you take the shoes off, you start to, like, work in these shapes, they're like, wow, this is tough for me. And like, we're not even using weight. We're just coaching position. We're pushing against the movable objects. And it was easy because, we had walls everywhere. So this is how we started sessions. We started working through position, coaching, movement, and then we started to build into these frameworks as they got more competent, as they got more comfortable, as they started to build some competency and training that they really didn't have experience with before this. So we couldn't hop into these more complex and advanced training methods that you would if, you had a 5-year NBA vet who spent 4 years in college, and that they've had, years of experience with the barbell. Some of the guys, they had never used the barbell. So it's like, if I want to apply these exercises that I know are great exercises, but I'm not meeting them where they are, I'm not really doing them the best service. So it really just came back to breaking things down into their simplest parts, working on isometric positions, coaching them through that, explaining to them those positions, and then having them go apply it on the field and come back. It really was it was so fun for me as a coach to start at that point with guys that were already working at such a high level.
Absolutely. No, I could not agree more. And it's so incredible, just going back to your concept of the training age, to see the skills that some of these athletes have. I just talked about it earlier today with a field hockey athlete, right? She's at the D1 level. She's highly, highly skilled at her sport. But then it's like you start to look at some of these other development qualities, and it's like, hey, was something missed along the lines? And
Right.
it's so fascinating to me because this conversation originated with an individual in the soccer space, Rob Butler, that I had a couple years ago. And he proposed a question. He's like, it's interesting how, from an intellectual standpoint, we run kids through a grade school system where they have to meet certain marks and learn certain things before they're allowed to progress to the next grade. Yet
Mhm.
when it comes to physical development, we don't do anything like that at
No.
all. We don't have a first grade versus third grade versus seventh grade differentiator. We just kind of let it run and hope for the best. And it's so fascinating to me how you get some of these higher level athletes that, as you mentioned, their training age is a little bit lower. They might be the best at their sport, but if you put them in their weight room, maybe they're functioning at a fifth grade level metaphorically. And it's like when I take them back and do those fifth grade level things, everything improves. And to your point on the isometrics, I'm a little biased on this, but I was doing some stuff with the force plates that way, just simple test retest for acute change because I wanted to know, hey, how powerful is this stimulus? How powerful is it when I take someone who is struggling to just simply do an isometric mid thigh pull for 5 seconds and they're shaking whole body like crazy? If we have them do a few isometrics and then go back and retest some of these different explosive type things that might carry over a little bit better to their sport, right? I don't care if you're running counter movement jump or rebound jumps or depth drop, whatever you're doing that way. I just found so much benefit from playing around with, hey, we're going to test after you've warmed up and we're going to do one isometric or two select isometrics and then retest. And some of the athletes we saw were seeing 20 to 30% improvement in some of their different metrics acutely. And it's like, dude,
Mhm.
like this is unheard of, but there's something incredibly powerful about taking that like high level athlete, going back to some of those simple, again, and we used the term low hanging fruit a few times, but that's ultimately what it is. It's right there. You just have to reach out and grab it, right? There's no real reward, in my opinion, for going for the stuff on the top shelf in this case. It's like grab what's available to you because that's the kind of stuff that you'll be able to fill your pantry with much, much faster. And
Yeah.
how more than ever in the athletic space, it's not just a matter of delivering results, it's a matter of delivering them quickly. So
Yeah.
if your framework doesn't do that, unfortunately, a lot of organizations and a lot of athletes don't keep you around because they don't have 5 years to wait on results. It's now or never. So having that ability to kind of step back, look at where the athlete is from a training standpoint compared
Right.
to their skill set, and then intervene where they need to from a training standpoint will blow up everything else. And it doesn't
Yeah.
seem to matter what sports science metric you like, whether that's RSI or mod RSI, whether that's breaking rate of force development or whatever it is that way. It's just so incredible to just meet the athlete where they're at, give them a good stimulus, and everything else just seems to fall in place.
Right. And yeah, it definitely, it goes further than that too, just to, once you do cross that line of you're making good change, then where do you go? Then where do you steer the ship? And that's where it gets, into that next level of complexity of, you know, setting goals, understanding where they're at, where they're trying to get to, and then choosing those things that, you're trying to train and make changes for, and then being able to test and retest. And that kind of like brings me back to like where I'm at now. Like the last year, I've been traveling with force plates. That's been fun because I went for a period of time, let's say P3, where you have access to everything, then being on the road and you have literally nothing. You're training guys on the road. I go on vacation trips with guys a lot, and you literally have nothing, but you're still trying to design these complex training programs and have some kind of test and retest philosophy that shows changes that are being made. Now I'm kind of drifting back into having some tools that allow me to test and retest and get back to, some of those more sports science driven principles in making changes for athletes. And, shout out to Hawken Dynamics. I know you're a Hawken user as well. It's been fun to travel with plates and bring them to, not just do one-off assessments with guys, but see the changes over time. To zoom out has been so fun. That's what I really like the most. And I know you wanted to talk about volleyball. It kind of goes perfectly into volleyball and a framework that I recently put together with an organization. Like I talk to a lot of teams and to see what they're doing with their sports science and how their organization collaboratively comes together to use all these tools. And this coach who specializes in this, and they have all these things together, all the tech, all the resources, and then I always ask them the $1,000,000 question. I'm like, all right, well, how does that affect your training? Like, how does that affect, the outcome? Like, how does that, like what is done with that information that you're collecting to make a change? and that's where a lot of times people are like, well, actually, not as much as you'd think, sadly, because, you need buy-in from not just the training department, the rehab department, but the coaching staff too, and the management and organization that has nothing to do with the training, but are powerful decision makers. So you really have to have this like holistic model all the way around. And, going back to volleyball, like that's what I was able to apply last year with the team in Puerto Rico, a pro volleyball team in San Juan in Cangrejeras. And we had this like trilogy of synergy between everybody, between the coaching staff, the owner, the performance staff, rehab, everyone was on the same page to where we were able to apply this tech and this situation perfectly. And I don't know if you want to comment or you want me to keep going. I can keep rolling
I was
through it.
gonna say, you mentioned the $1,000,000 question, but now I want the $2,000,000 question.
Go
How do you
ahead.
develop that? Because that's what everyone is looking to do, right? How do we
I,
get the owners, the coaches, performance, the rehab? How do we get everyone on the same page?
yeah.
Because ultimately, that's the holy grail question.
Yeah, because then it's like, without it, your work is really for nothing. It's like you're you're doing all this stuff, you're collecting all this data, you're fine tuning their program perfectly, and then the coach is like, "Yeah, I don't care. We're just gonna like make this a hard day when it shouldn't be a hard day." And I understand it's easier, from our side to say this because we're doing our job, but at the end of the day, they're not strength coaches. They're sport coaches, and they operate off of their instinct and emotions, which are very valid. They're the head coach steering the ship, and I get that, which is fine. But at the same time, if like you have all these resources and you want to use them, you kind of have to like at least take it into consideration of, hey, this is what the S&C department has found about this player or this group of players, or after this match. And these are our suggested changes. Take a look at them and maybe, think about it, So we kind of like dabble lightly. And I know I'm not speaking for every organization in pro sports. I'm sure some of them do this very well. Just my experience, specifically in Europe of how it works, and it hasn't gone so well from what I've discovered. So with this team in Puerto Rico, they reached out and they wanted to put together some kind of cohesive program that utilized these pieces of technology and to build a higher level performance programs. So I'm like, okay, first things first. I went through the $1 and $2 million questions of we need buy-in from everyone. Is the coach understanding and aware of what we're doing and the information that's going to be displayed to him to make informed choices around practice load, practice volume, players, jump count, things like that. Are they on board or open? Yes. Okay. Let's move forward. Now, do we have access to this stuff, this technology and the things that if I were doing it, I would implement? Yep. You're good. You got the green light. So I'm like, all right, let's try it out. So, we got Hawken to set us up with two pair of plates. We got catapult. Um, and we've got, weight room, great staff, great rehab, buy-in from the coach. We put together like a little RP collection model that was interesting too, just to kind of get, we have all this data that's being collected on them from, what the GPS is telling us, what the plates are telling us, but now we have this feedback from the athlete of what they're telling us. So, in and of themselves, they might not mean a lot, but collectively and zooming out over time, we could have some value here. So that was our hypothesis going in. And, we went through some different protocols of, assessing and testing, and, that can be a total another podcast, but the synergy was important. That was what needed to be there so that we could, collect in the right way, and data collection matters for sure. So it's repeatable, but, like having access to the Hawken plates, the test girls during practice, the test girls in the weight room, putting together a program that they followed consistently, that covered not only like needs-based mobility and correctives, but also strength and power development. Everything you'd want for a volleyball team. But then how do we essentially use and communicate this all together? That was where it was like, all right, we've got all the tools, we've got all the data. What can we do with it to make sure that we're moving in the right direction? So that's where building those reports, and Hawken does a great job of giving you a dashboard that you're able to you know create reports and export them really easily. So including daily reports, weekly reports to coaches, as to the head coach and the owners, as well as, the RPEs and, the catapult data, just so they have information to see how practices change to what they think is a hard practice versus the reality of what, hey, these are what the plates are showing us. This is what the GPS is showing us. This is what the girls are saying. So you have kind of like this three-way model to communicate the information to the coaches. So then they're like, okay, we can make an informed choice on, I can provide suggestions on like, this high-low model of not having like 3 really hard days in a row before a match. The obvious things I make suggestions on, but really communicating that to them in this holistic way of including all of these things. It was a really good season. We made a lot of great improvements and, just following that model consistently, you know, we can talk about like I have some of the data right here. I think if you want to comment on that, I'll pull it up here.
I think ultimately one of the things that S&Cs and performance coaches now more than ever have been tasked with is showing the value that they provide to an organization. And
Right.
this is a great example
Numbers
of
don't
how
lie.
they can do just that, right? Like
Yeah.
these are things that a lot of individuals, as you mentioned, are already testing, are already assessing. It's just a matter of what is the end goal of the assessment? Because a lot of times people collect numbers just to say that they're collecting numbers and
Right.
they
Right.
don't really have a process for it. It's, hey, we're going to test whenever we feel like it, whenever we're ready. And, I'll look back eventually and see what the numbers showed me. But ultimately, I'm just collecting data to get the numbers. And it's like, you could do that, but it's a lot more effective if you know where you're going, right? Like all roads might lead to Rome, but if you know where to turn, you get there an awful lot quicker than if
Right.
you're just kind of like free soloing it, for lack of a better way to put it. So I think
100%.
ultimately having a process in place, having an end goal in mind, and identifying what tools are going to go into that, right? Like, hey, we're going to do a three-headed monster of self-report, of GPS, and of force plates. Okay, great. All of those could be 1% off, right? Like maybe like the force plates aren't 100% accurate all the time. Maybe the GPS isn't 100% accurate all the time. I had a conversation with someone who ordered a bunch of GPS units from different individuals, threw them all on, and did a lap of a track, and all of them gave them different numbers. But,
Right.
it doesn't have to be exactly 100% accurate. And I think that's the thing that people misunderstand is they're looking for perfection every time. And it's like nothing is perfect every time. It gets a little
Right.
bit messy, but if you have some kind of data point that's established consistently and you can note trends over time and marry that with the other variables and other factors that are going on, you can really paint a very robust picture from that.
Exactly. And that can be applied to anything. Like, I mean, in your space in rehab, this is what you do. Like you're gonna have an athlete that starts with you at a certain point and you want to steer the ship in a direction that is probably gonna, improve whatever they're rehabbing. And, like these tools, if you're consistently collecting data in the same way, like you said, whether it's 1% off, it's gonna paint a picture when you zoom out. And that's what was so fun during this season was, we had a great staff there that was I was, working remote for most of this project. So I wasn't physically there for a lot of it. But, we communicated so effectively in how we collected the data, when we collected it, warm-up protocols. It was so repeatable that, yeah, in and of itself, like a one-off test could be valuable just to, show like owners want to see numbers. They want to see like, is this a good athlete? Do they jump high? Okay. But, like I knew the deeper value of over time, we can zoom out and see if we're moving in the right direction. Is, this wild travel schedule, or high match frequency in Puerto Rico, how is that like taking a toll on our starting players or our high load jumping players? Like what can we do to like bring them back up to their norms because we have hundreds of jumps. So I was able to, at the end of the season, I put together a little report to see, how the first few hundred tests compared to the last few hundred tests, because it wouldn't be fair to just pick and choose. But I wanted to kind of take the averages and see. And, like we had really good improvements, 50% improved jump height, 20% MRSI, 31% braking RFT. But the most improvement that I think I wanted to bring up was that I didn't expect. All these numbers are great. You obviously want to move forward and up. You don't want them to jump lower. But was jump quality. Like I thought jump quality was the thing that was I was most proud of because, like you see the numbers, you see the top end, but how they get there can be a different story or a different argument. And, as a rehab specialist, it's like movement efficiency matters, especially if you're talking about, avoiding injuries and, moving optimally. So to see like the curves change like in, a prettier way, like that was a huge win for us, of coaching, all the things that we did and, having a well-balanced program, that's something that zooming out from day one to, our thousandth test on them, it was cool to see that. And, you can only see that by zooming out and having consistently collected data over time.
I think one of the other important pieces about this, and this just goes back to the character stuff we discussed earlier, is like you have to be willing to admit when you're wrong and when you need to make improvements and changes that way in order for this to work. Because
Mhm.
what the data will show you is not just when things are good, but also when things are bad. And
Right.
while it's easy to tell other people what they have to change, sometimes it can be rather difficult to look at yourself in the mirror and say, like, hey, look, I tried this with the team. It didn't work. Now I have to go back and adjust. And those are
Sure.
very difficult, but real conversations that need to be had regardless of where you're at in the sports space. If you're using the science side, if you're using the tech and data side, and I think just as important as your framework for collecting and analyzing the data is your framework for looking back and reflecting on what you as a coach or what you as a provider can do differently because of that. If you're going to use it to inform decision making, which I I don't know why you might go about collecting a ton of numbers if you're not going to use them in some kind of constructive way that way. But sometimes that constructive way comes from you checking yourself and saying, like, hey, look, I need to adjust X, Y, and Z. It's not just the coaching staff. Sometimes it's on me as well that way. And those are difficult conversations to have, but ones that I feel like anyone in this science side of the space really needs to be honest with themselves about.
Yeah, and just the value you place on subjective versus objective data. It's like to be in a situation where you're not physically there, maybe you can't, eh, you know, communicate with the athlete as much as you could if you were physically there. You're just looking at data. That can be an interesting way to design a program or to start, your thought process versus, you know, living with the guy in Europe. You have no tech and you're reliant on conversation. Like, hey, how do you feel? Like, how did practice feel after we did this? Or like, how was this match compared to last match? Or like, like they'll be honest with you. Like they know their bodies way better than we ever could, regardless of how much tech we throw on them, how much stuff we try to implement. They're gonna know their bodies, and they've played enough matches, they've had enough practices, they've jumped enough, they've landed enough to know if they're feeling good or they're not feeling good. So, I also like to, really, you know, tell coaches like have the conversations with athletes, like develop a relationship to where you can ask them how they feel. Like, it's like that's invaluable to have real conversations with them where they feel comfortable to be like, hey, like I didn't feel too good after that one exercise we did. Okay, why? Like, let's maybe like choose a different tool or it opens you up to conversation and gives you a lot of insight rather than like, how do you feel? Good. Okay, well, like that doesn't do anything for me. So that's another thing that goes back to our the first part of our talk with the relationship side that can be a huge, invaluable, and free tool to use is just communicating and relating with your athletes.
Absolutely, and not being afraid to dig deeper, like you just mentioned.
Yeah.
It's like asking questions because I used to, and I feel like this might have been a side effect of schooling that way. It was like, well, if things aren't feeling good, you need to change them. It's like,
Hmm.
well, why not just dig a little bit deeper and figure out maybe why is it not feeling good? What other
Yeah.
factors could have influenced us getting there today? But I think
Sure.
a lot of times for one reason or another, we're a little too hesitant to dig a little bit deeper when in reality, what we're after is just below the surface. We just need to throw the
Hmm.
shovel in the ground and pull it out a little bit. So it's easier
Exactly.
said than done, I know. But it's one of those things that I find the more aware you become about all these different things, the more effective you become at them long term.
For sure. 100%.
Daniel, I feel like you and I could probably talk all day long, dude. This has been such a
Absolutely.
great conversation. We've covered so many amazing points and amazing topics that I feel like in general are not often discussed as much as I'd like them to be in this performance and rehab space that way. Do you have any kind of closing thoughts or closing remarks or anything we might have missed as we were talking today, man?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a great conversation. Like you said, we can talk about this all day, and I think it goes back to that commonality we have is we're not afraid to be difference makers, and kind of go against the norm of following into boxes and putting ourselves in situations that might be different than how everyone else is doing things, and that's okay. And I like being a trailblazer and kind of taking my own route in this industry and doing it for the right reasons and, just trying to help people. So, I think it's been good. I hope it encourages other coaches to, think outside of the box and, just see their athletes as more than just athletes. They have to see them as people and, that's a beautiful thing of working with other people. You get to relate with them and grow with them and you might learn something from them too.
Absolutely. No, I could not agree more. And Daniel, for people who want to find out more about you and Crafted Athlete, where can they find you all at online, man?
Yeah, primarily crafted.athlete on Instagram and actually craftedathlete.com will be launching this week. Doesn't exist yet, but it exists, but it's being built this week. So that will be a good landing page for anyone who wants to reach out, consulting work, or just to chat. I love talking with coaches or anyone interested in performance. These conversations are awesome, and I love to learn what other people are doing and what they found success with.
Yeah, that's amazing. Super exciting stuff. We'll link to all of that from the Instagram handles to the website and beyond in the description below. That way, if you didn't quite catch it, you can just click there and see everything that Daniel is up to. Dude, this was amazing. Really appreciate your
Nice.
time and the insights. Thank you for
Dan and Dan Show, episode 1.